And our next speaker is Karen Steward with the Burden Podcast. All right, well, hello everybody. As she said, my name is Karen Steward, and I have a podcast production company that started about a year ago. And so I've been having a lot of fun with that. And it is called Power of Pod Productions. And as part of my business, I do quite a few true crime podcasts. I do all kinds of podcasts, but somehow true crime has become something that I'm passionate about. I didn't expect to get into it, but here I am. Okay, so who am I? For many years, I worked for the NPR affiliate in Little Rock, Arkansas. And one of the things I did was cover the legislative session. So I'm very interested in the creation of laws and how they affect people, the criminal justice system, and the means by which victims can get justice within that. I also worked for 3.5 years for the Arkansas Supreme Court and learned a lot about the court system. So those are the two things, laws and the court system, that really does give me a passion for telling these stories. And with the public education initiatives, the justices and I traveled the state to give speeches. We created video and podcasts and just tried to educate people about the judiciary so that hopefully they would take a more active role in their government. I am also the creator of a podcast that came out in September called Burden. It examines the issue of intimate partner violence. And Billie Jean Letterman, she was 21 years old, and she died in Texarkana, Arkansas. She was shot in the head during a struggle with her husband, and he was never held accountable. So the story starts with a young woman named Ashley Myers, who is Billie Jean Letterman's daughter. And she spoke at a domestic violence rally a couple of years ago at the Arkansas State Capitol. And she got up to the podium and was very nervous, kind of like I am right now, and spoke about her mom. And she said, I saw, because she was in the house the night her mom was shot, she said, I saw my stepfather shoot my mom, and he was responsible, but he was never held accountable in the criminal justice system, which is quite a claim to make. And so when I watched news coverage that night of the domestic violence rally, Ashley wasn't on it. All the other speakers, there were snippets of them, but Ashley was not on the news. And so my co-host for Burden, her name is Stephanie Harris, she knew she wanted to tell Ashley's story, and she had a lot of friends in the media. And so she went up to them and tried to get someone to pick up Ashley's story, but none of them would. And I think it's because of all, the hours of research that would take. And if you're in a newsroom, they're not going to give you those hours. And so what I love about podcasting is we were able to request all the documents in the case, take our time, look at them, and so we decided podcast would be a good format for that. So this is the flyer that Ashley had at the domestic violence rally at the state capitol. She started a Facebook page called Justice for Billie Jean and was determined to get justice for her mom. So she really is a very compelling speaker. So that's Ashley when she was little, being held by Billie Jean Letterman, who died at age 21. And there are a lot of photos like this. And Ashley loved her mom, and it's a very compelling story. And it's also a very sad story because Ashley was 6 when her mom was shot in the head, and so has been missing out on that relationship ever since. So Burden was an 8-part series. We did a lot of research and I turned it into 8 episodes that covered everything from Billie Jean's life to her daughter Ashley's story, the crime scene that night, the autopsy, the story of Michael Letterman. His name is Michael Letterman, Ashley's stepdad, and where he comes from. Obviously, abuse just doesn't happen one day, and so we talked about his home environment. We also went on to talk about women that he abused since. Not surprisingly, if you're not held accountable, you will go on to abusing other women, and he did. And there were many women who, fortunately, were willing to talk about that. We also talked about her autopsy, and then the last episode provided legal analysis of charges that could have been filed against Michael Letterman. So this case is really sad because of the number of things that went wrong. Once we started looking into it, it wasn't, 3 things like I have up there. It was multiple things. We tried to get photos of the crime scene. They didn't exist at all. Ashley, who was 6 years old, they never took a formal statement from her. There were also people in the house that night after Billie was shot, no formal statements taken from them. We asked for the gun and the clothes, and they were missing. Nobody knows where the gun was. It might have been given back to Michael Letterman, and no one knows where the clothes are. So it was like she never existed, and that was a problem, obviously. One of the really crazy things about this case that's really upsetting is that when police arrived, the scene was cleaned up. There was no blood, nothing. And so they kept telling Ashley and anyone who inquired about the case that they couldn't do anything because they didn't have evidence because the crime scene was cleaned up, which legally does not make any sense. If that happens, something like that is front and center evidence. So that night, Michael's parents were there when police arrived, when paramedics arrived, and they cleaned up the house. Another thing is Michael Letterman's statement. So after Billie died, the next morning police interviewed him, and he never said what happened. It was, I don't know, and then again, I don't know. And then he asked for his dad, and they stopped the interview because he said he wanted his dad, and that was all that they did with Michael Letterman. Another thing that's very sad is we interviewed a policeman about the case. He was on the case, and he said, well, it might have been good if one of the women who was involved with Michael Letterman told her story. And what was strange is that in the file that we were looking at, we found a statement from a woman named Gay Leverett, who was actually Michael Letterman's first wife. And she had come to Nix, Officer Nix, who was the one that we interviewed later, who said there was no such interview, and she'd clearly given an interview, and clearly we had these statements of her saying he abused me and he put a gun to my forehead, but that was never used and it was never acknowledged. So the autopsy is another thing that we looked through. So Michael Letterman grabbed Billie. We know he grabbed her by the neck that night, but the medical examiner didn't take a picture of that side of her neck. He took a picture of the other side and many other things. But there's one photo of the front of her where you can see the beginning of, fingerprints, but that actual bruise isn't there, which would have helped a whole lot if that picture existed. And the medical examiner on that case was Fahmy Malik, and he was a very problematic medical examiner, and has, you know, if you know Fahmy Malik, ruled on many cases that just did not make sense. And Billie Jean's was one of those cases, in my opinion, as well. He listed her death as undetermined. And so we went to the medical examiner after Fahmy Malik and asked him to look at the case and just give his opinion. And what he told us is that, oh, well, my slide's wrong. Suicide is likely, not unlikely, that it was very likely because of the entrance wound. So that was yet another thing that was never talked about, and, you know, hindered ever getting justice for Billie Jean. So we interviewed the two police. There was a sheriff and then a policeman on the case. And the sheriff actually said, well, everybody that looks at this case agrees that it's homicide, but the scene was cleaned up and we can't do anything about it, and we didn't have any witnesses come forward, which is absolutely not the case. Ashley, the daughter, tried to come forward, but they wouldn't take a formal statement. They said you were 6 years old, so you don't count, is basically what they told her. So there was never, in interviewing these two police officers, the sheriff and the officer, no one ever really said, we don't think Michael Letterman did it. That seemed to be the consensus, that he did do it. Among the officers that we interviewed. And again, the logic there was the crime scene was cleaned up, so sorry, we can't do anything. And then, of course, these are, Michael Letterman went on to marry Jenna, who's on the left, and she had a terrible experience with him. We just called her and asked her to share her story, and she did, and it was scary. And then on the right is one of Michael Letterman's girlfriends, who also had a really scary story about Michael being very physically and verbally abusive to her. And neither of these women were ever interviewed by police. So ultimately, there's literally a new sheriff in town who said that he would look at the case. And so I'm going to call him. He just got into office and see. Really, I don't think there's ever going to be a trial and that Michael Letterman will ever be convicted. There are multiple things you can do if someone is involved in the death of someone. So if they have a gun, there's a struggle over the gun, and someone dies, you can absolutely bring a charge against them. But I hope through this podcast that there are other ways that we can get justice for Billie Jean if it's not through the court system. So what does justice look like? Hopefully through this podcast we showed that the court system failed Billie Jean. And then domestic violence education, I think, is an important part of that. Why did Billie stay in this relationship? Why do women generally stay in abusive relationships? The cycles of abuse, the Letterman family, and everything that, just cycles of abuse that are hard to ever break. And then, of course, the consequences of not stopping Michael Letterman and the multiple women who were abused by him afterwards. The good, if we can call it good thing, is that by interviewing Billie's sister, Billie's friends, they all told me that the experience was really cathartic and that finally someone cared about their story, which was a main goal of the whole project too. So sometimes in researching things, you find surprises, and there were rumors that one of the prosecuting attorneys at the time, who was in office during Billie Jean Letterman's case, we started hearing rumors that he was very abusive to women, that he would grab them by the hair pull them out of bars and just all kinds of terrible things. And so we did some Freedom of Information Act requests, and this is one of those side stories that was very disturbing to us. And today, Brent Haltom is a judge. He's been elected multiple times, and he's still in office despite this record. One of the first things we found is that his wife had accused him, and it never went to trial, so that's something I need to say, but accused him of sodomy and said that he used a gun to rape her, but that he became a lawyer afterwards. He still became a lawyer, so apparently doing that didn't stop anything. We know that he pled no contest to dogfighting. We know that he also pled no contest to a charge of threatening an officer and a DWI. He told the Texarkana Gazette that he loves to attend executions because he loves, especially for people that he prosecuted. So that was his opinion on that. And then the family had a furniture store, and his mother was shot in the store, and Brent Haltom told reporters that she was likely shot because someone was getting back at him. So all kinds of just really crazy things. But like I said, Judge Haltom continues to practice and is a judge today. Real quick, I just wanted to talk about some future topics for Burden. I'm glad we took on Ashley's case. All of the seasons won't be revolving around domestic violence. The next season that I'm planning has to do with wrongful convictions, actually, and forced confessions. So something I've been looking at is a recent Supreme Court decision and its implications. So we have a law that says that criminals can't appeal to a federal court more than once. And that is because of an oral argument that the Arizona Attorney General made in front of the U.S. Supreme Court and said it doesn't matter if, the rule is it's a blanket law, you can only appeal once. And so that's created a lot of problems. And the sentence that was in that oral argument was, innocence is not enough. So we don't care if they're innocent. It's a blanket rule that you can only do it once. And so I'm taking on the case of a man from Arkansas who's currently in prison and has not been released, but I think, trying not to make a statement, but I do think right now that he absolutely is innocent. But what's even more sad is that he appealed to a federal court, but it was just by writing a note that said, I'm innocent. There were no legal arguments made, and they counted that as an official appeal. And now he can't ever be in front of a federal court again to make different arguments. I also plan to cover the topic of police accountability. So there's a case of an unarmed black man who was sitting inside his home on his couch, and he had his door open to his apartment. And two officers came in and argued with him. The officers admitted that they were the first to touch him and start the argument, and then they shot him. And what was weird about how they shot him too is that the two officers were leaving and then turned around and shot him on the couch. So they were not even in his apartment, which is actually, there are police rules against shooting into a building. So there were 4 officers on the scene that night. They called for backup on the case. And what's really sad is that at least 2 of the other officers have said, we didn't feel like our life was threatened that night. So they shot him, but not because we thought our life was threatened. The police involved were all cleared of wrongdoing. There was a civil lawsuit about it that actually resulted in one of the largest settlements. But this police department said that the officers did nothing wrong. A twist to the story is that his sons were in law enforcement. And so one aspect of the story is how it split this police department between black and white, basically, and people had to choose sides or felt like they did. Real quick, another thing I'm working on is a book to podcast project, and it is not out of Arkansas like the other two cases are. It's a book called The Cop and the Stalker, and I think it's going to be a really compelling story. We're recording it in New York. It's about an NYPD officer who becomes so obsessed with a criminal that he ends up in jail. So that should be an interesting one. And there's more, so New York Magazine also featured The Cop and the Stalker. And so we're trying to turn that into a podcast since people aren't reading books as much, aren't reading magazines. Hopefully we can tell that in a compelling way. So that's me. I do cover true crime, and if anyone in this room has an idea for a true crime podcast, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I would love that. So Karen at Power of Pod is how you can find me, or just go to powerofpod.com. So this evening we're going to make an announcement about a new nonprofit that we have formed that helps people start podcasts. And one of our board members is here today, and I want to invite him up on stage because we're very privileged to have him and all of his experience. His name is Clint Schaff, and I'm going to let Clint tell you a little bit about his experience.
Oh, thanks so much, Karen. Give it up for Karen, All right, I'll be really fast. My name is Clint Schaff. I was a founding employee of LA Times Studios, which is a wholly owned production arm of the Los Angeles Times. So we produced the podcast you see above. We did at least 5 what I would call true crime podcasts, I guess. We did Chasing Cosby, which was reported and hosted by Nikki Wythensee Egan, a reporter from Philadelphia, who had been reporting on Bill Cosby's crimes since the very beginning. Went through a lot of because people doubted that she was telling the truth. Man in the Window, about the Golden State Killer, reported by Paige St. John, Pulitzer Prize winner. And then 3 podcasts reported and hosted by Christopher Goffard. Dirty John, of course, also Detective Trap, and The Trials of Frank Carson. And so I was really proud to bring those podcasts to market. And it's interesting, I host a radio show here in the area, and I do some stuff in audio, but I've been more behind the scenes bringing these stories to the market. So that, and for me, the motivation was journalism is so important, and investigations, and this type of storytelling that tells compelling stories and brings justice to people's lives and shines a light on the dark shadows of our lives, the world that we're in, is so important. And so I just want to give it up to all of you also, and that you have a role in bringing that as well through your patronage of these products, right? Like by listening, by maybe supporting an advertiser here or there, or getting involved on their Patreon or whatever, because this is really hard work that folks like Karen do, and that the reporters I mentioned do. And so you have a big part in this shining light on these injustices by supporting these stories. So props to you all. I'm really proud to be a supporter of this kind of work. And when I moved to Arkansas, I live in Bentonville, nearly 2 years ago, I was so excited to meet Karen and to meet Ty King over here and to learn about the work that we're doing to bring together podcasters here in Arkansas. So you'll hear a lot more later today about the Arkansas Podcasters Collaborative, but stay tuned, y'all. There's a big event coming up in early September in Little Rock that hopefully y'all can make it to. And then we're going to try to do an event up here in Northwest Arkansas as well, also in September this year. So look forward to seeing you all again there. And again, keep up the good work in supporting these important podcasts, and props to the True Crime Fest here for bringing us all together today. Thanks again.
literally chilling with us. We're still working on that. Thank you, Karen, for everything that you do. I'm so excited for you. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take a break. We're going to take our lunch break.